Marriage in Skyrim is simple. You find someone, wear an amulet, say a few words, and suddenly you've built a life together. It's clean, straightforward, almost too perfect. But the more you look into it, the more cracks start to show. Because not every spouse in Skyrim is as normal as they seem. Some have pasts that don't quite add up. Others have habits, dialogue, or implications that feel off in ways the game never fully explains. They're not dangerous in an obvious way. That's what makes them unsettling. It's the small details, the quiet lines, the things you only notice after the fact. So today we're ranking the most disturbing wives in all of Skyrim. Not based on strength, not based on usefulness, but based on how uncomfortable they become the more you think about them. Some characters in Skyrim feel unsettling because of what they are, but Muri is disturbing because of what she becomes, and how easily she gets there. On the surface, she seems like one of the more grounded potential spouses in the game. You meet her in Markarth, working at the Hag's Cure, a quiet apothecary tucked away in a city already filled with tension and moral ambiguity. She doesn't stand out immediately. She's polite, soft-spoken, even somewhat sympathetic when you first speak to her. But the moment you dig just a little deeper, the initial impression starts to fall apart in a way that feels far more personal than most other characters in the game. Muri isn't just tied to darkness, she actively invites you into it. Her story revolves around betrayal. She was taken in by a man named Alain Dufont, someone she trusted, someone she believed cared about her. But that trust was exploited. He used her to gain access to a wealthy family, stole from them, and then disappeared, leaving Muri to take the blame. As a result, she was cast out, her reputation destroyed, her life effectively ruined. On paper, it's a tragic backstory, one that fits comfortably within Skyrim's world of hardship and misfortune. But it's what Muri does with that pain that makes her unsettling. Instead of moving on, instead of trying to rebuild, she fixates on revenge. And not in a distant or emotional way, but in a cold, calculated one. She joins the Dark Brotherhood, not out of desperation, not because she has no other options, but because she chooses it as the most effective way to get what she wants. And when you take on her contract, the way she speaks about it is what really stands out. There's no hesitation, no moral conflict, just clarity. She wants Elaine dead. That much is expected. But then she adds something else, something that shifts the entire tone of the situation. She asks you to kill Nilzine Shadowshield as well, an innocent woman who had nothing to do with the betrayal beyond being connected to the family that cast Muri out. And her reasoning, it's not strategic, it's not necessary, it's personal. She believes Nilzine deserved it, not because of anything she did directly, but because she was part of the life Muri lost. It's guilt by association, taken to an extreme that feels deeply uncomfortable. And the way Muri presents this request is what makes it worse. She doesn't beg, she doesn't struggle to justify it. She simply expects you to understand. That quiet expectation is what makes her so disturbing, because it reveals how far she's basically already gone. By the time you meet her, Muri has already crossed the line. The revenge isn't a breaking point, it's a continuation of something she's fully committed to. And if you choose to carry out both killings, she rewards you not just with gratitude, but with affection as well. Her approval isn't just tied to the completion of the contract, it's tied to how thoroughly you carry out her version of justice. And that's where things take an even darker turn. Because Muri is a potential spouse. After everything, after the manipulation, the revenge, the willingness to see an innocent person dead, you can marry her, settle down, build a life together. And the game presents this as completely normal. There's no added tension, no lingering consequence, no moment where her past catches up to her. She transitions seemingly from orchestrating murders to running a shop and offering you daily income. That contrast is what makes her so unsettling in the context of marriage, because nothing about her has actually changed. She hasn't reflected, she hasn't grown, She hasn't shown any sign that what she did or asked you to do was wrong. It's just over, or at least it's treated that way. But as a player, that knowledge doesn't go away. You know what she's capable of, you know she thinks. And the fact the game allows you to place her into such a calm domestic role without addressing any of that creates a kind of dissonance that's hard to ignore. It raises uncomfortable questions. If she was willing to go that far once, what's stopping her from doing it again? If someone else crosses her, even in a small way, how would she respond? And more importantly, how much of her kindness is genuine, and how much of it is simply directed at you because you helped her get what she wanted? Unlike other darker characters in Skyrim, Muri doesn't feel distant or exaggerated. She feels grounded, real in a way that makes her actions harder to dismiss. There's no Daedric influence guiding her, no madness distorting her perspective. Everything she does comes from a place that feels human. And that's what makes it worse, because her story isn't about corruption, it's about choice. She was wronged, yes, but the path she takes afterwards was entirely her own. And the fact that she walks in so confidently, without hesitation or regret, is what pushes her into genuinely disturbing territory. In a game where many spouses are defined by simplicity and routine, Muri stands out as someone whose past never quite settles, no matter how normal things appear on the surface. And because of that, she earns a solid 9 out of 10 on the disturbing scale. Some characters in Skyrim are unsettling because of hidden darkness, others because of past actions. But Janassa is disturbing because she doesn't hide anything at all. From the moment you meet her in the Drunken Huntsman in Whiterun, she presents herself with a kind of honesty that feels refreshing at first until you actually listen to what she's saying. She's a mercenary, a sellsword, someone who lives by the blade. That alone isn't unusual in Skyrim, it's actually quite common. But the way Janassa talks about violence, the way she frames it, not as a necessity, not as survival, but as something closer to expression, is what makes her stand out in a much more uncomfortable way. Janassa doesn't just accept killing, she enjoys it. And more than that, she seems to appreciate it. When she speaks about combat, there's a tone to it that feels almost artistic. She talks about battle like it's a craft, like every strike, every movement, every kill is part of something more refined than simple brutality. There's no anger behind it, no sense of chaos. It's controlled, deliberate, almost elegant in her mind. And that's where the unease begins. Because most violent characters in Skyrim are driven by something: rage, loyalty, desperation, ideology. Even assassins like those in the Dark Brotherhood frame their actions within ritual and belief. But she doesn't rely on any of that. She strips violence down to its core and then builds it back up as something admirable, something worth doing for its own sake. She makes it sound clean, which in a world like Skyrim feels deeply unnatural. When you travel with her, this perspective becomes even clearer. She doesn't question your decisions. She doesn't hesitate, no matter what you ask of her. Bandits, guards, innocents, it doesn't matter. There's no moral line she refuses to cross. No situation where she steps back and says, "This is too far." She follows, she fights, she kills, without judgment. And that complete willingness to do anything you ask of her is what makes her so unsettling as a companion, and even more so as a spouse. Because when you marry Janassa, nothing about that mindset changes at all. There's no shift in her personality, no softening of her views. She doesn't suddenly adopt a more peaceful outlook or reflect on her past. She simply brings that same philosophy in a domestic setting. One moment she's speaking about home, routine, and shared life. And the next, she's still the same person who views a blade through someone as something almost beautiful. That contrast is where the discomfort really sets in, because it creates a kind of duality that never fully resolves. On one hand, she can be calm, loyal, even supportive in a traditional sense. She fulfills the role the game assigns to a spouse without issue. But underneath that, there's this unwavering acceptance of violence that never fades. It's not something she turns off. It's just part of who she is. And the game never challenges it. There's no moment where worldview is questioned or pushed back against. No dialogue that forces her to reflect or reconsider. She exists in a kind of moral vacuum, where a perspective is presented as just another valid way of living in Skyrim's harsh world. But the more you think about it, the harder that becomes to accept. Because Janassa doesn't just live in a violent world, she elevates that violence into something more, something intentional, something refined. And that raises uncomfortable questions about what she values and how she sees the people around her. What if she tries to kill you? If combat is an art form to her, what does that make her enemies? Targets, subjects, materials? It blurs the line between survival and expression in a way that feels deeply off, even by Skyrim's standards. What makes it even stranger is how composed she is. There's no madness in her voice, no instability in her behaviour. She's calm, measured, and completely in control of herself. That level of clarity makes her harder to dismiss as just another violent character. She knows exactly what she's doing, and she's perfectly fine with it. That quiet certainty is what lingers, because it suggests that this isn't a phase or a reaction to a circumstance. It's a philosophy, one she's fully embraced. And that doesn't leave much room for anything else, does it? As a follower, that makes her incredibly effective, reliable, adaptable, unquestioning. But as a spouse, it creates a kind of underlying tension that never fully goes away. You're not just living with someone who can fight. You're living with someone who sees violence as something more than just a means to an end. And that perspective never fits comfortably into the peaceful life. In a game where many companions and spouses are defined by simplicity, Janassa stands out because of how consistent she is. She doesn't hide her nature. She doesn't soften it. She just is who she is, from beginning to end. And while that honesty might seem admirable at first, the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because there's nothing stopping her, no boundaries, no hesitation, no line she won't cross. Just a blade, and the belief that using it is something worth appreciating. And for that reason, Janassa earns a 7.5 out of 10 on the disturbing scale. A lot of characters in Skyrim don't feel disturbing at first. They feel powerful, respected, even admirable. And Ayla the Huntress fits that role perfectly. She's a central figure in the Companions, one of the most iconic factions in the game, and everything about her presentation suggests strength, confidence, and control. She's a skilled warrior, a devoted member of her circle, and someone who clearly understands her place in the world. But the more you look at what defines Ayla, not just what she does, but what she believes, the more that image starts to shift into something far more unsettling. Because Ayla doesn't just fight, she worships the act of hunting. And not in a casual or cultural sense, but in devotion to Herson, the Daedric Prince of the Hunt. Now, Daedric worship in Skyrim isn't exactly rare. There are countless characters tied to Daedric princes in one way or another. But what makes Ayla stand out is how normalized her devotion is. She doesn't hide it, she doesn't treat it as something dangerous or forbidden. To her, Herson isn't a distant, mysterious force. He's something to be respected, followed, even admired. And that belief is directly tied to what she is. Ayla is a werewolf, not temporarily, not reluctantly, but by choice. While other members of the Companions eventually seek a cure, seeing lycanthropy as a curse or something they've outgrown, Ayla embraces it completely. She doesn't view it as a burden, she sees it as a gift, an extension of her identity, something that connects her more closely to the Daedric Prince and the ideals she values. Strength, instinct, the thrill of the hunt. On its own, that might not seem disturbing. After all, Skyrim is full of transformations, powers, and supernatural elements. But what makes Ayla different is how comfortable she is with it. There's no internal conflict, no hesitation, no sense that she's struggling with what she's become. She is basically just like Janassa. She's already decided, and she's at peace with it. That certainty is what starts to feel off, because when you look closer at what being a werewolf actually entails, losing control, feeding on others, giving in to instinct over reason, It's hard to reconcile that with the idea of a stable, grounded character. And yet Ayla never questions it. She doesn't draw a line between her human self and her transformed state. To her, it's all part of the same existence, which raises an uncomfortable idea. Where does the control end and the instinct begin? As a companion, Ayla is loyal and capable. She fights alongside you without hesitation, fully embracing the role of a warrior. But there's always that underlying layer to her character, that connection to something more primal, more unpredictable. And while the game never forces that unpredictability into direct conflict with the player, the implication is always there. She's not just a warrior, she's something else, something tied to a Daedric force that values the hunt above all else. And that perspective carries over into her views on the world itself. Ayla doesn't see hunting as a necessity, she sees it as a purpose. There's a difference there that's easy to overlook. Survival is one thing, but when the act itself becomes something you revere, something you align your identity around it starts to take a different meaning. It becomes a belief system. And like any belief system, it shapes how you see others, how you even see your spouse. In Ayla's case, that lens is built around predator and prey, strength and weakness, the natural order as defined by Herson. And while that might align with Skyrim's harsh environment on a surface level, it also strips away a lot of the nuance that defines other characters. There's less room for empathy, less room for restraint. Because in her world, the hunt is always justified. That becomes even more noticeable when you consider her as a spouse. Much like Janessa or Muri, Ayla can transition into a domestic role without any real change to her core identity. She does become supportive, present, even warm in certain interactions. But none of her underlying beliefs shift. She is still devoted to the Daedric prince, still fully committed to her werewolf nature, still aligned with a worldview that prioritizes instinct and dominance over anything else. Can you imagine your spouse turning into a werewolf and running out of the house, going off to kill someone, leaving you at home to deal with the children? And again, the game treats this as completely normal. There's no moment where that tension is addressed, no reflection on what it means to build a life with someone whose identity is so closely tied to something inherently violent and uncontrollable. It's simply accepted. But when you stop and think about it, that acceptance feels uneasy. Because Ayla isn't hiding anything at all. She's telling you exactly who she is, a follower of a Daedric prince, a hunter who embraces the act itself, a werewolf who has no desire to return to anything else. And she expects you to be fine with that. What makes her less disturbing than something like Muri or even Janassa is that her beliefs are at least consistent with the world she lives in. Skyrim is harsh and survival often requires strength and violence. Ayla takes that reality and leans into it completely. There's logic there, even if it's taken to an extreme. But that doesn't make it comfortable, because there's always the sense that her version of the world leaves very little room for anything beyond the hunt. And once you see that clearly, it's hard to ignore. For her unwavering devotion, her complete acceptance of her own transformation, and the quiet intensity of the beliefs that define her, Ayla the Huntress earns a 7 out of 10 on the disturbing scale. Skyrim gives you the illusion that marriage is simple. Pick a partner, settle down, build a life. It's clean, predictable, almost disconnected from the chaos happening everywhere else in the world. But when you actually look closer, that illusion starts to fall apart. Because characters like Muri, Janassa, and Ayla don't leave their pasts or their beliefs behind. They bring them with them, into your home, into your life, with your children. And the game never really stops to question what that means. Muri stands at the top for a reason. She isn't just shaped by betrayal, she chooses to become something colder because of it. Her willingness to have not just her betrayer killed, but an innocent person tied to him, shows a level of detachment that feels deeply personal. And the fact that she can move on from that so easily, stepping into a normal life without reflection, that's what makes her the most disturbing. Janessa then comes next. Not because she hides anything, but because she doesn't. Her complete openness about violence, the way she frames it, as if something is almost artistic, removes any sense of moral grounding. There are no limits with her, no hesitation, just a calm acceptance that anything can be solved with a blade. And then there's Ayla, the most understandable of the three, but still far from normal. Her devotion to the Daedric Prince and her full embrace of being a werewolf places her in a world defined by instinct and the hunt. It makes sense within Skyrim, but that doesn't make it any less unsettling when you really think about it. And that's what ties all three of them together. They don't feel disturbing at first. It's only when you stop and really consider who they are, what they've done, what they believe, that it starts to sink in. Because Skyrim never forces you to question your choices, but sometimes you probably should. Followers in Skyrim are supposed to make things easier. Extra damage, someone to carry your gear, another presence in fights. It's a system built around support, and most of the time that's exactly what they are. But not all followers work that way. Some create more problems than they solve, some act unpredictably, and some feel like they're working against you more than with you. Whether it's their behaviour, their abilities, or just the situations they bring with them, these followers stand out for the wrong reasons. Not because they're weak, but because they complicate everything around them. And the more you travel with them, the more you start to notice it. Some followers in Skyrim are problematic because of how they fight, how they behave in combat, or how unpredictable they can be when things go wrong. Sven is different. On the surface, he seems harmless, almost forgettable. A simple bard from Riverwood caught in a small personal rivalry, with no real power, no dangerous abilities, and no obvious flaws that would make him stand out. But the more you look at how Sven becomes a follower, the more it becomes clear that the problem isn't what he does, it's what he represents. Because Sven isn't recruited through loyalty, bravery, or even mutual respect. He's recruited through deception. When you first meet him, he's locked in a petty feud with Fandel. At first, it feels like a typical Skyrim side story. Two characters competing for someone's attention, each trying to win you over. But Sven's approach immediately stands out for the wrong reasons. Instead of proving himself, instead of being honest about his feelings, he asks you to deliver a fake letter, a forged message designed to manipulate Camilla into turning against Fandel. And the game gives you a choice. You can go along with it, play into Sven's plan and help him succeed through a lie, or you can expose him. But if you do help him, if you choose to support that deception, Sven becomes available as a follower. And that's where the problem starts. Because from the very beginning, your partnership with Sven is built on something dishonest. There's no sense that he's earned your trust, no moment where he proves himself in a meaningful way. Instead, he benefits from manipulation, and then seamlessly transitions into a role where he's supposed to support you without question. And while that might not seem like a major issue mechanically, it creates a strange dynamic that doesn't sit quite right. Because you know exactly how he handles situations that matter to him. He cuts corners, he lies, he takes the easier path, even if it means dragging someone else down. And that mindset doesn't just disappear once he starts following you. In fact, it quietly defines how he feels as a companion. Compared to other followers, Sven doesn't bring much to the table in terms of combat effectiveness. He's not particularly strong, not especially durable, and doesn't have any standout abilities that make him useful in difficult situations. But being weak isn't what makes him problematic. Plenty of followers have their limitations. What makes him stand out is how unreliable he feels. There's no confidence when he's with you, no sense that he'll hold his own when things go wrong. And because of how he was introduced, that lack of confidence feels earned. And you've already seen how he handles pressure. And it wasn't impressive. It was dishonest. And that creates a subtle but persistent disconnect. Because followers in Skyrim are often defined by what they bring to battle, not just in terms of strength, but in terms of presence. Lydia feels dependable. Janassa feels capable. Even someone like Fandel, Sven's direct counterpart, feels more grounded because of his straightforward nature. Sven doesn't have that. He feels like someone who ended up in the role by circumstance rather than merit. And that becomes even more noticeable the longer you travel with him. There's no development, no moment where he grows beyond the initial impression. He remains the same person, the bard who chose deception over honesty, now following you through situations far more serious than anything he was originally involved in. It creates an odd contrast, because on one hand, he's participating in dangerous quests, fighting enemies, travelling across Skyrim, but on the other, he still feels small, not in power, but in character. And that's what makes him problematic in a way that's easy to overlook. He doesn't cause chaos, he doesn't break mechanics, he doesn't actively get in your way more than any other follower might, but he undermines something else. The idea that your companions are reliable, that they've earned their place beside you. With Sven, that foundation never really exists. It's built on a choice that you know wasn't right, tied to a character who never proves that he's better than that moment. And because of that, every interaction with him carries that same underlying thought. If this is how he handles something as simple as personal rivalry, what happens when things actually matter? The game never answers that question directly. Sven doesn't betray you, doesn't escalate into something worse, but the doubt remains, quietly shaping how he feels as a companion. And in a system where trust, both mechanical and narrative, is such a big part of the experience, that doubt is enough to make him stand out. Not as the worst follower, not as the weakest, but as one of the most problematic. Because sometimes it's not about what a follower does wrong in the moment. It's about what you know they're capable of, and how little it takes to see it again. Lydia is one of the first followers most players ever get in Skyrim, and because of that, she often becomes the default companion for a huge portion of the game. She's reliable on paper, granted to you as Housecarl of Whiterun, sworn to carry your burdens, heavily armoured, durable, and always ready to charge into fight. For players running a straightforward warrior build, she can feel like exactly what you need. But the moment you step outside that playstyle, especially into stealth, precision, or more controlled approaches, Lydia quickly turns from dependable to deeply problematic, and not in a subtle way. The biggest issue starts with one simple fact. Lydia has no concept of subtlety. Stealth in Skyrim relies on positioning, patience, and control. You move carefully, avoid detection, pick targets one by one, and ideally clear encounters before enemies even know you're there. Lydia completely disrupts that flow. Her default behaviour leans towards aggression, and once combat is even remotely triggered, she commits fully. There's no hesitation, no attempt to maintain your stealth advantage. She will charge forward, weapon drawn, often before you've even fully assessed the situation. And once that happens, everything falls apart. Enemies that could have been picked off quietly are now fully alert. Carefully planned routes become chaotic fights. Your advantage disappears instantly, replaced by a loud, uncontrolled engagement that you didn't ask for. And the worst part is that it often feels unavoidable. Even when you try to position her, even when you command her to stay back, the moment things shift, she has a tendency to break that control and dive straight into combat. It's not just that she's bad for stealth, it's that she actively works against it. Then there's the issue of noise and presence. Lydia's heavy armor isn't just a visual trait, it has gameplay implications. She clanks, moves loudly, and makes it far easier for enemies to detect your presence. Especially in tight environments like caves or ruins, when you're trying to remain unseen, every small movement matters. And Lydia adds a constant layer of risk simply by existing near you. And unlike followers who specialise in archery or light armour, she doesn't naturally complement a stealth build. She's designed for direct confrontation, not careful infiltration. So instead of enhancing your playstyle, she forces a shift away from it, turning what should be controlled encounters into messy, unpredictable fights. But stealth isn't the only area where Lydia becomes problematic. Her positioning, something that might seem minor at first, becomes a constant source of frustration the longer you travel with her. Skyrim's environments are filled with narrow corridors, tight doorways, and confined spaces. Lydia has a habit of standing directly in those spaces, blocking movement in a way that feels almost intentional. Whether it's a doorway you're trying to pass through, a hallway you're navigating in, or even just a small room you're trying to move around in, she often ends up exactly in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because of how follower pathing works, getting around her isn't always easy. You stop, you adjust, you try to move past, and she moves with you. It creates this constant friction in moments where movement should feel smooth. And in combat, that friction can actually become dangerous. Getting stuck behind Lydia while trying to retreat, reposition, or avoid damage can turn a manageable situation into something far more chaotic. There's also the issue of traps and environmental awareness, or the lack thereof. Lydia does not navigate the world carefully. Pressure plates, swinging blades, traps hidden in ruins. These are all things a cautious player learns to avoid. Lydia, on the other hand, will walk straight through them without hesitation. And I suppose that's the same for most followers, but with Lydia, it just kind of irritates the player. And because she often follows closely behind you, this can lead to situations where you've successfully avoided a trap only for her to trigger it in seconds and you get flung across a cave. Whether it's arrows firing down a hallway or a spike trap activating, her lack of awareness turns environmental hazards into shared problems. It breaks the sense of control you have over your surroundings. Because even if you do everything right, she might not. And then there's combat itself. On paper, Lydia is strong. She can take hits, deal solid damage, and survive longer than many early game followers. But that strength comes with its own set of issues. Her tendency to rush into fights means she is often drawn aggro in unpredictable ways, pulling enemies in directions you didn't plan for. She can interrupt your attack, step into your line of fire, or turn a focused encounter into a scattered one. For ranged builds, archers or mages, this becomes especially frustrating. You line up a shot and Lydia steps in front of it. You prepare a spell and she charges into the exact space you were targeting. It creates a constant need to adjust, to compensate, to work around her rather than with her. And over time, that dynamic becomes exhausting. Instead of feeling like you have a partner, it feels like you have an obstacle that occasionally helps. Even outside of mechanics, there's something about Lydia's presence that reinforces this. She's loyal, unquestionably so, but that loyalty doesn't come with adaptability. She doesn't evolve alongside your playstyle. She doesn't adjust to how you approach the game. She remains consistent. And while consistency can be a strength, in this case it becomes a limitation. Because no matter how you play, she plays the same. And that disconnect is what ultimately defines her as one of the most problematic followers in Skyrim. It's not that she's useless, she's actually far from it. In the right context, she feels incredibly effective. But the moment you move outside of that context, her strengths start to turn into weaknesses. And those weaknesses begin to impact every part of your experience. Stealth becomes harder, movement becomes restricted, combat feels less controlled. And instead of enhancing your journey, she complicates it. Lydia isn't a bad follower, but she is a rigid one. And in a game built around freedom and choice, that can quickly become one of the biggest problems you have to work around. Some followers in Skyrim are problematic because they interfere with your playstyle, others because they lack strength, awareness, or reliability in combat. Koznak is different. He isn't just inconvenient or poorly suited to certain builds. He represents a deeper kind of problem, one that sits somewhere between narrative design and gameplay execution. On the surface, he's easy to overlook, a drunken brawler sitting in the Silver Blood Inn in Markarth, asking for a fight. But the more you engage with him, the more it becomes clear that Koznak isn't just a simple companion option. He's a follower whose entire identity creates a disconnect between what Skyrim expects from its companions and what he actually delivers. To even recruit Koznak, you don't complete a quest, you don't get something for him, prove your worth, or build any kind of relationship. You punch him. That's it. A short, bare-knuckle brawl in the middle of a tavern. And suddenly he's willing to follow you anywhere. There's no deeper interaction, no meaningful dialogue that builds context or trust. Compared to other followers, housecarls who serve you due to status, mercenaries who require payment, or characters tied to quests, Koznak's recruitment feels almost hollow. It's immediate, transactional in the simplest way possible, and over just as quickly as it begins. And that simplicity carries over into everything else about him. Koznak doesn't have a strong narrative presence. He isn't tied to a major storyline, faction, or event. He exists in Markarth as a background detail, a representation of the city's harsher environment. Its working class struggles, its sense of wear and exhaustion. That works well for world building, but when that same character becomes a follower, the lack of depth becomes more noticeable. There's nothing anchoring him to your journey, no personal stake, no evolving dialogue. He follows because you want to fight. And that's where the context ends. That alone doesn't make him problematic though, but it does set the stage. Because when a follower lacks narrative weight, their gameplay performance becomes even more important. And that's where Koznak begins to struggle. In combat, Koznak is serviceable at best. He leans towards melee combat, using one-handed weapons, but lacks the durability and presence of stronger warrior-type followers. He's not particularly tanky, doesn't have standout abilities, and doesn't bring anything unique to encounters. He fights, he takes damage, and he survives if the situation allows it, but there's no moment where he feels essential. And that creates an immediate issue, because if a follower doesn't stand out narratively, and also doesn't stand out mechanically, what exactly are they adding? With Koznak, the answer often feels like not much, but the real problem isn't just that he's underwhelming, it's how that underwhelming nature clashes with the idea of him as a character. Koznak is introduced as someone tough enough to brawl in a tavern, someone who's clearly used to physical confrontation. There's an exception, even a subtle one, that he should bring that same rough, durable energy into combat situations. But he doesn't. Instead, he feels inconsistent, not weak enough to be dismissed immediately, but not strong enough to rely on. The middle ground is where many of Skyrim's most forgettable followers sit. But with Koznak, it feels more noticeable because of how little else there is to compensate for it. And then there's his behaviour. Like many melee-focused followers, Koznak has a tendency to charge directly into combat without much regard for positioning or strategy, much like Lydia. On its own, that's not unusual. Many followers do the same, even my followers. But with Koznak, it becomes more of an issue because he doesn't have the durability to fully support that aggression. He'll engage quickly, draw attention, and then struggle to maintain control of the fight. This leads to situations where you have to compensate for him. You adjust your positioning, you redirect enemies, you manage fights more carefully, not because of your own build, but because of his limitations. And over time, that dynamic becomes frustrating. A follower should reduce pressure, not add to it. They should create opportunities, not force constant adjustments. Koznak often does the opposite. There's also something to be said about his thematic theme within Skyrim as a whole. Markarth is one of the most complex cities in the game, full of political tension, hidden corruption, and layered conflict. Characters tied to it often reflect that complexity, but Koznak doesn't engage with any of it. He exists on the surface level of the city's identity without connecting to the deeper elements that define it. That makes him feel disconnected, not just from your journey, but from his own environment. And often that disconnection carries into gameplay. When you travel with him, there's no sense that he belongs in places you go. No unique dialogue, no reactions that tie him to events or locations. He's present but not involved, active but not engaged. In a game where immersion plays such a big role, that absence becomes noticeable. Even smaller details begin to add up. His lack of versatility means he doesn't adapt well to different playstyles. Whether you're sneaking, casting spells, or engaging in ranged combat, Koznak doesn't complement these approaches. He defaults to the same behaviour regardless of context, which limits how effectively he can fit into varied strategies. And unlike followers who might compensate with personality or unique interactions, Koznak remains relatively static. He doesn't evolve, he doesn't surprise you, he doesn't change how you approach the game. He simply follows. That simplicity might work for a short time, especially if you pick him up early or out of curiosity. But the longer you travel with him, the more those limitations start to define the experience. You begin to notice what's missing, both in terms of gameplay contribution and narrative presence. And once you see that, it's hard to ignore. Koznak isn't broken. He doesn't disrupt mechanics in extreme ways. He doesn't actively sabotage your play, but he exists in a space where he doesn't quite meet the expectations set by other followers. He lacks the strength of dedicated warriors, the utility of specialized companions, and the depth of characters tied to meaningful stories. And because of that, he becomes difficult to justify keeping around. Not because he fails dramatically, but because he never quite succeeds. In a system where followers are meant to enhance your journey, to add something tangible, whether that's power, personality, or presence, Koznak feels like an incomplete piece. He fills the role mechanically, but without the impact that makes that role worthwhile. And that's what makes him one of the most problematic followers in Skyrim. When you place Koznak alongside someone like Lydia, the contrast makes his issues even clearer. Lydia, for all her flaws, at least has a defined role. She's durable, consistent, and built to handle direct combat. You know what you're getting with her, even if that comes with problems like poor stealth compatibility or clumsy positioning. She has a presence both mechanically and narratively, as your housecarl. Koznak, on the other hand, lacks that same clarity. He isn't strong enough to rival Lydia in combat, doesn't have the same durability to absorb damage, and doesn't carry any real narrative weight to compensate for it. Where Lydia can feel intrusive and frustrating, Koznak often feels replaceable. And in a strange way, that makes him worse. Because at least with Lydia, you're dealing with a follower who impacts your experience, positively or negatively. With Koznak, the issue is that he barely impacts it at all. He doesn't shape your playstyle, doesn't challenge your decisions, and doesn't offer anything that another follower couldn't do better. So while Lydia may be more actively problematic in certain builds, Koznak ends up being the weaker follower overall, simply because there's no real reason to keep him around once you have other options. Serana is, on paper, one of the most fully realised followers in all of Skyrim. She has a detailed backstory, extensive dialogue, quest involvement, and a level of personality that most companions simply don't reach. But that same depth is exactly what makes her one of the most problematic followers in the game. Because unlike simpler companions who quietly fall into line with your playstyle, Serana constantly pushes against it, not in one obvious way, but through a combination of mechanics, behaviour, and design choices that slowly build into something far more disruptive than helpful. The first issue appears before you even have a choice in the matter. Serana isn't optional, at least not for a significant portion of the Dawnguard questline. Once she enters your story, she stays with you. You can't dismiss her, you can't swap her out, and you can't avoid her presence without stepping away from the content entirely. That forced companionship immediately sets her apart from most followers in Skyrim. With Lydia, Koznak, or any other recruitable companion, you decide when they join and when they leave. With Serana, that control is basically removed, and while that might make sense from a narrative's perspective, it creates friction on a gameplay level. Because if your playstyle doesn't align with hers, you're stuck with her anyway. And that's where her second major issue comes in, her constant use of necromancy. Serana frequently reanimates fallen enemies during combat, turning them into temporary allies. On the surface, this sounds useful. More bodies on your side, more pressure on enemies, more chaos working in your favour. But in practice, it often has the opposite effect. The creatures she raises are usually weak, short-lived, and tactically insignificant. They don't meaningfully shift the outcome of most fights, especially at higher levels. What they do change is the clarity of combat. Suddenly, there are moving parts, more bodies in the way, more visual noise. It becomes harder to track enemies, harder to line up attacks, harder to maintain control over the situation. And because these reanimated creatures are temporary, they don't provide lasting value. They just add short bursts of clutter that interrupt the flow of combat. This becomes especially frustrating for range or precision-based builds. You line up a shot, and a reanimated corpse stumbles into your path. You prepare a spell, and the battlefield is suddenly filled with distractions that weren't there moments before. Instead of enhancing your effectiveness, Serana's necromancy often dilutes it. It creates a layer of unpredictability that you didn't ask for and can't really manage. And unlike other followers, you can't simply tell her to stop. It's part of her identity, hard-coded into how she fights. Then there's her AI behaviour, which amplifies these issues even further. Serana is more active than most followers. She moves frequently, engages quickly, and rarely stays passive. While that can be helpful in straightforward combat, it becomes a problem in more controlled scenarios. Stealth once again suffers. Serana isn't as aggressively disruptive as someone like Lydia, but she still struggles to maintain subtlety. She moves when you want her still, engages when you want to wait, and reacts in ways that don't always align with your intentions. It creates a constant sense of mismatch. You're trying to approach a situation one way, and she's already doing something else. That lack of synchronization turns even simple encounters into something less predictable. And because she's tied so closely to the main Dawnguard storyline, you experience this over a long stretch of gameplay. It's not a short-term inconvenience, it's a sustained presence that you have to adapt to, whether you like it or not. Her dialogue, while one of her strongest features narratively, also contributes to her problematic nature over time. Serana talks a lot. She comments on environments, reacts to situations, and expresses her personality in ways that most followers don't. At first, this feels like a major improvement. Finally, a companion who feels alive. But over time, it starts to wear on the experience. Her lines repeat, her tone remains constantly negative or weary, and her commentary begins to feel less like insight and more like background noise. There's a persistent sense of complaint in how she interacts with the world, whether it's her disdain for certain environments, her reactions to weather, or her general outlook. There's a heaviness to her presence that doesn't shift much over time. And because you can't easily step away from her during large parts of the game, the tone becomes something you're constantly exposed to. It's not overwhelming in a single moment, but it builds, slowly turning what initially felt like depth into something more repetitive and at times draining. And then there's the issue of control, or rather the lack thereof. Most followers can be directed with some level of precision. You can tell them where to stand, where to wait, how to approach certain situations. Serana, however, often feels less responsive to that control. She moves independently, makes decisions quickly, and doesn't always follow commands in a way that feels reliable to you as a player. That independence might make sense for her character, but in gameplay terms it reduces your ability to manage her encounters effectively. You're not fully coordinating with her, you're reacting to her. And that shift in dynamic is what ultimately defines her as problematic. Because followers in Skyrim are supposed to support your approach to the game. They should adapt, assist, and enhance what you're already doing. Serana instead introduces her own layer of decision-making, her own priorities, her own way of interacting with the world. And you don't get to opt out of that. Even her strengths, her survivability, her magical abilities, her narrative importance comes with trade-offs. She's durable, but that durability means she stays in fights longer, extending chaotic encounters. And I suppose to a certain player that might be good, but to others it also might pose as a problem. She's powerful, but that power is applied in ways you can't always direct. She's important to the story, but that importance removes your freedom to choose when and how you engage with her. It all adds up to a follower which is constantly present, constantly active, and constantly shaping your experience in ways that aren't always beneficial. When you compare Serana to someone like Koznak, the contrast is almost extreme. Koznak's problem is that he barely adds anything. He's passive, underwhelming, and easy to ignore. Serana is the complete opposite. She adds too much presence, too much interference, too much influence over how situations play out. Where Koznak fades into the background, Serana dominates it. And that makes the comparison surprisingly clear. Koznak may be forgettable, but Serana is unavoidable. In terms of being problematic, Serana ultimately takes that spot. because a follower you can ignore is far less disruptive than one you're forced to constantly work around. So, Serana isn't weak, she isn't useless, but she is intrusive. In a game built around player choice and flexibility, that intrusion stands out more than almost anything else. Because it's not about one specific flaw, it's about how multiple small issues combine over time. The necromancy that clutters fights, the AI that resists control, the forced companionship that limits choice, the dialogue that gradually shifts from engaging to repetitive. Individually, each of these could be overlooked. Together, they define the experience. And that's what makes Serana one of the most problematic followers in all of Skyrim. Not because she fails to contribute, but because she contributes in ways that constantly pull against how you might want to play. Not all problematic followers in Skyrim cause issues through mechanics alone. Some create a different kind of disruption, one that lingers in the background and slowly reshapes how the game feels the longer they're around. Cicero is the perfect example of that. On a surface level, he's actually a strong follower, agile, effective in combat, capable of dealing solid damage, and able to hold his own in most encounters. If you're judging purely on performance, he doesn't immediately stand out as a liability. But the problem with Cicero isn't how he fights, it's how he exists alongside you. Because the longer he follows you, the harder it becomes to ignore the constant, unpredictable presence of his madness. From the moment you meet him, Cicero is defined by instability. His speech is erratic, his tone shifts without warning, and his behaviour sits somewhere between playful and deeply unsettling. At first, that unpredictability can feel entertaining. He's different from every other follower, louder, more expressive, more memorable. In short bursts, it works. He stands out in a game where many companions blend together. But Skyrim isn't built around short bursts, it's built around long journeys, extended exploration, and hours of continuous travel. And that's where Cicero begins to wear on the experience. Because unlike other followers who fade into the background when nothing is happening, Cicero fills the silence. He talks often, and when he talks, it's rarely calm or neutral. His lines jump between tones, mocking, cheerful, aggressive, cryptic, sometimes all within the same stretch of dialogue. There's no consistency to ground him, no steady baseline that lets you settle into his presence. And over time, that lack of stability becomes exhausting. You're not just travelling through Skyrim, you're travelling with constant noise. It's not just the frequency of his dialogue, but the nature of it. Cicero doesn't comment on the world in a way that adds context or insight. He doesn't provide grounded observations or useful reactions. Instead, his lines often feel disconnected from what's happening around you, rooted more in his own internal state than the environment you're both moving through. That creates a kind of disconnect where his presence doesn't enhance immersion. It pulls you out of it. Moments that should feel quiet, atmospheric, or reflective are interrupted by erratic laughter, sudden tonal shifts, or lines that don't quite fit the situation. And at first, it's easy to brush off, but over time it builds. There's also the psychological effect of his unpredictability. Most followers in Skyrim operate within a set of expectations. You understand how they'll react, how they will behave in combat, and how they will move through the world. That consistency allows you to plan, to coordinate, to feel in control. Cicero disrupts that, not always in a mechanical sense, but in a perceptual one as well. You're never entirely sure how he's going to behave in a given moment. Not because he's unreliable in combat, he usually performs well, but because his personality introduces a constant sense of instability. There's a subtle tension in having him around, even when nothing is happening. A feeling that something is slightly off, slightly unpredictable, slightly outside your control. And that tension doesn't go away. It becomes part of the experience. In combat, Cicero is actually quite capable. He's often cited as one of the best followers in that sense. His agility and damage output make him effective in many situations, and he doesn't suffer from the same weaknesses as followers like Koznak. But even here, his presence can feel disruptive, not because he performs poorly, but because of how he frames the encounter. His vocalizations, his movement, his overall energy shifts the tone of fights. What might otherwise feel like a controlled strategic encounter instead becomes something more chaotic, more erratic. And again, that's not always a mechanical problem. It's a tonal one. Because Skyrim's combat, while often hectic, still allows for a sense of rhythm and control. Cicero introduces a layer of unpredictability that can break that rhythm, not by failing, but by constantly reframing the situation in a way that feels less grounded. Then there's also the issue of long-term compatibility. Cicero isn't a follower you can easily adapt around. With someone like Lydia, you learn her limitations and adjust your playstyle. With Serana, you work around her abilities and behaviour. But with Cicero, the challenge isn't just mechanical, it's experimental. You're not just adapting to how he plays, you're adapting to how he feels to have around. And that's a much harder adjustment to make. Because it's not about efficiency or effectiveness, it's about comfort. About whether his presence enhances your time in the game or slowly detracts from it. And for many players, the longer Cicero stays with them, the more that balance starts to shift in the wrong direction. What makes this especially interesting isn't that it's entirely intentional. Cicero isn't poorly designed. He's designed very specifically to be unsettling. His madness is part of his identity, deeply tied to the Dark Brotherhood and the role he plays within it. In that context, his behaviour makes sense. It adds depth, reinforces themes, and creates a unique character that stands out in a meaningful way. But when that same character transitions into a long-term follower, these traits don't change. They persist. And what works well in short, narrative-driven moments doesn't always translate cleanly into extended gameplay. The qualities that make Cicero memorable also make him difficult to live with over time. His unpredictability, his constant dialogue, his tonal inconsistency, they're all effective in creating a character, but they're also effective in creating friction. Compared to other problematic followers, Cicero occupies a very different space. Lydia interferes with mechanics, Koznak lacks gameplay, Serana overwhelms with presence and forced interaction. Cicero, however, affects the atmosphere of your entire playthrough. He changes how the game feels on a moment-to-moment basis, not by altering systems, but by altering perception. And that kind of influence is harder to ignore, because you work around mechanics, you can compensate for weaknesses, but it's much harder to tune out a presence that constantly demands attention, that never fully settles, that always feels just slightly off. Even in the quieter moments, walking through forests, exploring ruins, standing still, Cicero is there, filling the space with something unpredictable. And over long periods, that unpredictability stops feeling fresh and starts feeling intrusive. Not in a way that breaks the game, but in a way that changes it. Cicero isn't the worst follower in Skyrim. In many ways, he's one of the most effective. But effectiveness isn't the only measure that matters. When a follower begins to shape the tone of your experience in ways that you didn't choose and can't easily escape, that's when they become problematic. And with Cicero, that influence is constant, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it settles in. Barbas doesn't follow the same rules as other companions in Skyrim, and that's exactly why he stands out as arguably the most problematic follower in the entire game. He isn't someone you recruit in the usual sense. He doesn't respond to commands in a meaningful way, and most importantly, can't be dismissed for a large portion of his associated quest. On paper, that already puts him in a difficult position. But once you actually travel with him, it becomes clear that Barbas isn't just inconvenient. He actively disrupts the flow of the game in ways that no other follower quite manages. The first issue is immediate and unavoidable. Barbas is loud, not in a subtle, occasional way, but constantly. He barks repeatedly, loudly, often at the worst possible times. Skyrim is a game that relies heavily on atmosphere, quiet exploration, ambient sound, and the distant wind across mountains, the subtle tension of entering a dungeon. Barbas cuts through all of that. His barking doesn't blend into the environment, it dominates it. What should be quiet, immersive moments are instead filled with repetitive noise that quickly becomes grating the longer you're around him. And unlike most followers, you can't control it. You can't tell him to be quiet. You can't adjust his behaviour. You can't even send him away until his questline is resolved. That lack of control is what turns a minor annoyance into a major problem. But even if you like the idea of his character, even if you appreciate his connection, you're still forced to deal with the same constant auditory presence for as long as he's with you. But the noise is only the beginning. Barbas also has some of the most intrusive pathing behaviour of any companion in the game. He follows extremely closely, closer than most humanoid followers, and has a tendency to move directly into your space. This becomes especially noticeable in tight environments such as caves, ruins, and narrow hallways. He blocks doorways, stands in your path, and often makes simple navigation more difficult than it needs to be. You stop, he stops. You move, he moves into you. You try to adjust, and he adjusts into you. It creates a constant sense of friction, where movement feels less fluid simply because he's always there, slightly in the way. And unlike other followers who at least have some variation in how they position themselves, Barbas feels persistent in his proximity. There's no breathing room at all. In combat, Barbas presents an even more complicated problem. On one hand, he's technically useful. He can't die, which means he'll continue to engage enemies indefinitely. He draws attention, absorbs hits, and can act as a distraction in fights. That sounds beneficial, but in practice it often creates chaos rather than control. Because Barbas doesn't fight intelligently, he charges in, pulls aggro unpredictably, and moves erratically during encounters. This makes it harder to manage fights in a deliberate way. Enemies scatter, positioning breaks down, and any sense of strategy becomes secondary to reacting to whatever direction Barbas has just pushed the fight in. For players using stealth, this becomes even worse. Barbas has no understanding of subtlety. He doesn't wait, doesn't hold position, doesn't respect your approach. If enemies are nearby, he'll move, bark, and engage in ways that can immediately give away your position. Carefully planned infiltration turn into open fights, not because of your actions, but because of his behaviour. And once again, you can't stop it. He doesn't respond to commands in the same way other followers do. You can't reliably position him, can't tell him to stay behind, can't manage his involvement in the way you would with someone like Lydia or Serana. He operates on his own logic, and you're forced to adapt to it. There's also a deeper issue tied to how long he remains with you. Barbas is part of a Daedric quest, and like Serana, he stays with you until that quest is completed. But unlike Serana, who at least offers narrative depth and evolving dialogue, Barbas remains relatively static. His personality doesn't develop, his behaviour doesn't change, and his presence doesn't shift over time. What you experience in the first 10 minutes with him is what you'll experience hours later. And that consistency, combined with his already intrusive traits, makes his presence increasingly difficult to tolerate the longer you delay completing his quest. Because that's the other side of the problem. If you don't want to deal with him, your only real option is to rush through his storyline. That creates a strange dynamic where the game subtly pressures you to finish content, not because you're invested in it, but because you want relief from the follower attached to it. That's a rare situation in Skyrim. Most companions enhance your willingness to explore, to take time, to engage with the world. Barbas does the opposite. He makes you more aware of how long you've been travelling with him, more eager to reach the end of his quest, more focused on getting back to the state where you have control over your own experience again. Even his invincibility, which might seem like a clear advantage, contributes to the problem. Because he can't die, he never leaves combat situations naturally. He'll continue engaging enemies long after it would be more efficient to disengage, dragging fights out or pulling additional enemies into the encounter. There's no risk of losing him, but that also means there's no way to naturally remove him from a situation once he's involved. He's always present, always active, always affecting the flow of gameplay. Compared to other problematic followers, Barbas stands in a category of his own. Lydia blocks your path and disrupts stealth. Serana overwhelms with mechanics and forced presence. Cicero unsettles with his personality. But Barbas combines multiple issues into one. First of all, he's a talking dog, which should make him one of the most charming companions in the game. And I suppose the way you look at it, it kind of does. On paper, that's a unique and interesting idea. A Daedric entity taking the form of a loyal, conversational animal has a lot of potential. But in practice, it adds to the problem rather than solving it. His voice lines repeat often, his tone doesn't vary much, and the novelty wears off quickly. Instead of feeling like a rare, memorable companion, he becomes another constant presence you can't escape, just one that also happens to bark between conversations. So that's what ultimately makes Barbas one of the most problematic followers in all of Skyrim. Not because he's weak, not because he fails in combat, but because he constantly takes control away from the player. He reshapes how you move, how you fight, how you experience the world, and does so without giving you the tools to respond. And in a game built on freedom, that loss of control stands out more than anything else. Barbas isn't just along for the journey, he literally defines it, until you finally find a way to end it. At first glance, Rhea seems like she would be one of the most promising followers in Skyrim. She's part of the Companions, one of the game's most well-known factions, trained in combat, surrounded by experienced warriors, and positioned within a group that values strength, honor, and growth. That alone creates an expectation. You assume that anyone coming out of Yorviskar, even someone relatively new, will carry some level of competence and identity in the role of a follower. But Rhea ends up existing in a strange space where those expectations are set up and then never fully fulfilled. And that gap between what she should be and what she actually is becomes the core reason she stands out as one of the more quietly problematic followers in the game. Unlike many other companions, Rhea doesn't have a strong defining hook. She isn't tied to a major personal quest, doesn't have a deeply explored backstory, and doesn't undergo any visible development through your time with the Companions. She's presented as a relatively new recruit, someone still learning, still finding her place. And that's an interesting concept in theory. A follower who represents potential rather than mastery could add a different dynamic, something that evolves over time or reflects growth alongside the player. But Skyrim never really follows through on that idea. Rhea remains static. She starts as a novice figure with an experienced group, and she stays that way, even after everything you accomplish with the Companions. That lack of progression is where the first issue begins to take shape, because when a follower is framed as inexperienced, there needs to be some form of payoff. Either they improve, reveal hidden depth, or compensate in other ways. Rhea doesn't quite do any of those. She exists in a kind of narrative limbo, where her role is clear, but her impact isn't. And because of that, once she becomes available as a follower, there's an immediate sense that she hasn't fully earned that position in the same way other companions have. Mechanically, Rhea leans into light armor and one-handed combat, which already places her in a slightly awkward position compared to more specialized followers. She's not as durable as heavy armor tanks like Lydia, but she also doesn't fully commit to stealth or range support in a way that would make her stand out. She kind of sits in the middle, a hybrid that doesn't quite excel in any one area. And while that kind of versatility can sometimes be useful, in Rhea's case it ends up feeling more like a lack of identity than a deliberate strength. In combat, this becomes noticeable quite quickly. She can hold her own in smaller encounters, dealing consistent damage and surviving against weaker enemies. But as situations scale up, as fights become more complex, enemies more aggressive, environments more restrictive, her limitations start to show. She doesn't absorb damage well enough to act as a reliable frontline, and she doesn't deal enough burst damage to quickly remove threats. This forces you into a position where you're compensating for her more often than relying on her. Much like Lydia, you step in to take pressure off her. You adjust positioning to keep her alive, you manage fights more carefully because she can't fully sustain her role. And while that dynamic can exist with many followers, such as Lydia, it becomes more noticeable with Rhea because there isn't much else to offset it. She doesn't bring unique abilities, doesn't provide specialized support, and doesn't change how you approach encounters in a meaningful way. She's present, but not impactful. That same issue extends beyond combat into overall gameplay flow. Followers in Skyrim tend to fall into categories: tanks who absorb damage, stealth companions who support quiet playstyles, or specialized characters who bring something unique to the table. Rhea doesn't clearly fit into any of those. She's not disruptive in the way Lydia can be for stealth builds, but she's also not particularly helpful in maintaining stealth either. She doesn't actively sabotage your approach, but she also doesn't really enhance it. And that creates a kind of neutrality that becomes its own problem. Because neutrality doesn't stand out, it doesn't shape your experience, it doesn't give you a reason to choose her over someone else. In a system where you have access to so many followers with clearer strengths or more defined roles, Rhea becomes easy to overlook. Not because she fails dramatically, but because she never quite succeeds in a memorable way. There's also a broader thematic issue tied to her connection with the companions. As a member of that faction, she's surrounded by some of the most distinct personalities in the game. Ayala, Vilkas, Farkas, each with their own identity, their own role, their own presence. Even secondary members of the group often feel more grounded in the world, more connected to the faction's themes and history. Rhea, by comparison, feels like she exists on the edge of that identity rather than within it. She doesn't fully reflect the companions' values in ways that stand out. She doesn't contribute to their narrative beyond being present. She doesn't evolve as the faction's story progresses. And that disconnect becomes more noticeable once you step outside of the building and bring her into the wider world. There's no sense that she carries the weight of the companions with her, no unique dialogue that reinforces her place within that group. She just becomes another follower, stripped of the context that might have made her more interesting. Even her personality, while not unpleasant, doesn't leave a strong impression. She's friendly, somewhat optimistic, and clearly respects the player. But those traits don't develop into anything deeper. There's no arc, no shift, no moment where her perspective changes or expands. She's just kind of bland. And over time, her dialogue becomes predictable, repeating without adding new layers to her character. And in a game where some followers grow on you the longer you travel with them, Rhea tends to plateau early. You understand her quickly, and there's nothing more to discover. This lack of depth feeds back into her gameplay issues. When a follower isn't mechanically strong, personality can often compensate. When they aren't narratively complex, gameplay can carry them. But when both areas feel underdeveloped, the overall experience starts to feel thin. And that's where Rhea struggles the most. She isn't actively frustrating. She isn't disruptive in obvious ways. She doesn't create chaos or break systems. But she also doesn't justify her place. And that's a quieter but still significant kind of problem. Because over time, you start to notice the absence of impact, the lack of moments where she turns the tide of a fight, the absence of dialogue that deepens your connection, the feeling that she's there more out of convenience than intention. And once you start comparing her to other followers, those with stronger identities, clearer roles, or more engaging presence, that gap becomes harder to ignore. When you place Rhea next to someone like Ayala the Huntress, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Ayala has a clear identity. She's confident, skilled, deeply tied to the companions in a circle. And mechanically, she excels with archery, giving her a defined role in combat that complements a wide range of playstyles. She feels intentional both in how she fights and how she fits into the world. Rhea, by comparison, feels unfinished. Where Ayala reinforces the strength and legacy of the companions, Rhea highlights its lower ranks without ever growing beyond them. Ayala shapes encounters and adds presence. Rhea simply just participates. And in that comparison, Rhea's biggest issue comes clear. She isn't just weaker, she's overshadowed in every meaningful way. So the potential that Rhea does represent never quite materializes. a character who could have offered a different perspective, a newer member of a legendary faction, growing alongside the player, but instead remains static, caught between roles without fully committing to any of them. And while that doesn't make her the worst follower in Skyrim, it does make her one of the more problematic. Because sometimes the issue isn't what a follower does wrong, it's what they never quite do at all. And with Rhea, that absence becomes the defining part of that experience. Torvar sits in a strange corner of Skyrim's follower system, one where narrative implication, mechanical limitations, and player perception all overlap in a way that quietly turns him into one of the most problematic companions in the game. At a glance, he should feel like a natural fit. He's a member of the Companions, much like Rhea, a faction that was built on strength, honour and martial skill. In Yovaskar, alongside some of the most respected warriors in Skyrim and Rhea, there's an expectation that he carries some of that same capability. But the moment you spend any real time around Torvar, that expectation starts to break down, replaced by something much less reliable. Torvar is defined almost immediately by one trait. He drinks. A lot. This isn't just a small piece of flavour dialogue. It's the core of how he's presented. He's frequently intoxicated, often talking about drinking and generally framed as someone who lacks the discipline you'd expect from a member of such a prestigious group. On its own, that could have been an interesting contrast. A flawed warrior, someone struggling to meet the standards of those around him, could have added depth to the Companions. But like several other characters in this space, Torvar never really evolves beyond that single note. And that becomes the first major issue. Because when a follower is built around a defining flaw, there needs to be something that balances it. Growth, hidden strength, or at least a mechanical role that reinforces their place. Torvar doesn't quite deliver on any of those fronts. Instead, his characterization as a heavy drinker ends up bleeding into how players perceive his effectiveness. Whether or not the game explicitly supports that mechanically, and in practice, that perception isn't entirely wrong. In combat, Torvar functions as a fairly standard melee follower. He uses one-handed weapons, engages enemies directly, and behaves much like other companions in terms of basic AI. But unlike stronger or more defined members of the faction, like Vilkas or Farkas, he doesn't stand out in terms of durability or damage output. He's serviceable, but not exceptional. Capable, but not dependable in a way that inspires confidence during more difficult encounters. This creates a familiar problem. He exists in the middle, much like Rhea, not weak enough to be immediately dismissed, not strong enough to be relied on. And without a unique ability, specialization, or standout trait to elevate him, that middle ground quickly becomes a limitation. Because in Skyrim, where followers often compete for your attention based on what they bring to your playstyle, being fine isn't enough. It's forgettable. But Torvar's issues go beyond simple combat performance. They tie directly into how he fits or fails to fit within the identity of the Companions themselves. This is a faction that was built on the sense of brotherhood, a discipline, and shared purpose. Even with their internal secrets and flaws, there's a clear standard that members are expected to uphold. Characters like Ayala embody that through skill and confidence. Others, like Farkas, bring a sense of strength and loyalty that reinforces the group's identity. Torvar doesn't reinforce that identity. If anything, he undermines it. His constant association with drinking, his lack of visible progression, and his relatively low impact in both narrative and gameplay creates a disconnect. He feels like someone who exists within the faction, but not fully as part of it. And when that kind of character becomes a follower, that disconnect carries over into your experience. You're not travelling with a representative of the Companions at their best. You're travelling with one of their weakest links. That perception is what leads to one of the more unusual aspects of Torvar's reputation. His frequent mention as a good candidate for Boethiah's sacrifice. Now, mechanically, almost any follower can be used for that quest. The game doesn't assign moral weight or unique consequences based on who you choose, but players still make decisions about who to sacrifice based on attachment, usefulness, and perceived value. And Torvar constantly ends up near the top of that list, not because the game tells you to choose him, but because he feels like the easiest loss. That alone says a lot, because it highlights a fundamental issue. Torvar doesn't create enough connection, either mechanically nor narratively, to make players hesitate. When given a choice that requires betrayal, players naturally look for someone they won't miss, someone who doesn't impact their journey in a meaningful way. And Torvar fits that role almost too well. He's accessible, he's underwhelming, he lacks strong ties to your progression. And because of that, he becomes expendable. That sense of expendability is what ultimately defines him as problematic, not because he fails in a dramatic or disruptive way, but because he fails to justify his place in Skyrim's world, in a system where followers are meant to enhance your experience, through strength, personality, or narrative weight. Torvar struggles to provide any of those consistently. Even his personality, while distinct in its focus on drinking, doesn't evolve into something deeper. There's no arc where he overcomes that flaw, no moment where he proves himself despite it, no shift that recontextualizes how you see him. He remains static, locked into that initial impression. And over time, that lack of development makes his presence feel increasingly thin. It also affects how he interacts with the broader world. Like many followers, Torvar doesn't have extensive, unique dialogue for different locations or events. But because his base personality is already limited, that lack of variety becomes more noticeable. There's no sense of growth as you travel, no new perspective that emerges, no deeper layer to uncover. He starts simple and stays that way. From a gameplay perspective, this creates a situation where he's easy to replace. As you gain access to stronger followers, more specialised companions, or characters with deeper narratives, Torvar naturally falls behind. There's no clear reason to keep him with you unless you're specifically choosing to. And even then, that choice often feels like it requires justification, rather than offering it. And that's the core issue with him. A good follower gives you a reason to bring them along. A great follower makes you want to keep them. Torvar does neither. He exists as an option, but not as a compelling one. When you compare him to others within the same faction, the gap becomes even more apparent. Ayala brings ranged precision and a strong personality. Farkas offers durability and presence. Vilkas adds a sense of leadership and skill. Even newer or less central members often feel more grounded in the identity of the companions. But when you compare Torvar to someone like Koznak, the similarities become almost impossible to ignore. Both are defined heavily by drinking. Both are introduced in ways that emphasize that trait over anything else, and both end up feeling like followers who never move beyond that initial impression. Koznak sits in Markarth as a brawler for hire with little narrative weight, while Torvar exists within the Companions, a faction that should elevate him, as I've said, but in practice they land in nearly the same place. Neither offers standout compatibility, neither brings meaningful development, and neither creates a strong reason to keep them around long term. The only real difference is context. Koznak is expected to be rough around the edges, while Torvar is surrounded by characters who highlight just how underwhelming he feels. And because of that, Torvar arguably comes off worse. He has more to live up to, and doesn't reach it. Bringing Rhea into the comparison adds another layer. Like Torvar, she suffers from a lack of identity and impact, but in a different way. Rhea feels undeveloped, like potential that never turns into anything, while Torvar feels defined by a single flaw that never evolves. Between the three, Koznak and Torvar sit closest together. Both are easy to overlook, easy to replace, and often viewed as expendable. Rhea at the very least has the framework of growth, even if it's never realised. But Torvar and Koznak, they feel static from beginning to end, which is exactly why players rarely hesitate when choosing between them and literally anyone else. Torvar is basically just an afterthought, and that leaves him in a difficult position. He's not broken, not disruptive, not actively harmful to your gameplay, but he also doesn't contribute in a way that makes him stand out. He fades into the background when you don't need him, and when you do, he doesn't rise to the occasion in a meaningful way. Which brings everything back to that reputation, the idea that he's an easy sacrifice. Because in a game full of choices where followers can become allies, companions, even long-term fixtures in your journey, Torvar rarely reaches that level. He remains optional in the most literal sense, not just because the game allows it, but because nothing about his presence demands otherwise. And in a system built on connection, impact, and choice, being forgettable might be the biggest problem of all. Roggy Knotbeard is the kind of follower who, at first glance, feels like a small, almost harmless addition to Skyrim's long list of companions. Another miner from a remote settlement, another character with a simple quest, another option you can take along if you feel like it. He's easy to unlock, tied to Kyne's Grove, and his personality leans into a rough working-class charm that fits the world well enough. But the moment you look beyond that surface, Roggy starts to reveal one of the most quietly limiting design flaws a follower can have: an extremely low-level cap. And while that might not sound immediately dramatic, it ends up defining his entire usefulness, and ultimately his place among the most problematic followers in the game. The issue with a low-level cap isn't just about numbers, it's about longevity. Skyrim is a game built around progression, where both the player and the world scale over time. Enemies grow stronger, encounters become more complex, and your abilities expand in ways that allow for more varied and powerful playstyles. Followers are expected to keep up with that progression, or at least remain relevant within it. Roggy doesn't. His level cap is so low that he effectively stops growing very early in the game, long before most players have even settled into their preferred build. And once he hits that cap, that's it. No further improvement, no scaling to match tougher enemies, no adaptation to the increasing demands of the game. He becomes locked in place while everything around him continues to evolve. At low levels, this isn't immediately obvious. Roggy can hold his own in early encounters, dealing reasonable damage and surviving against weaker enemies. If you recruit him early enough, he might even feel perfectly serviceable for a short time. But Skyrim isn't designed to stay in that early phase for long. As you explore, level up, and take on more challenging content, the gap between Roggy and the rest of the game begins to widen. And it widens quickly. Enemies that once posed a mild threat become significantly more dangerous. Dungeons introduce tougher opponents, bosses become more resilient, and fights require more coordination and durability. Roggy, meanwhile, remains exactly as he was. His damage doesn't scale to match these new threats, and his survivability drops off sharply as enemy strength increases. This creates a fundamental imbalance. Instead of supporting you in combat, Roggy starts to feel like someone you need to protect. You find yourself adjusting your approach not to maximize efficiency, but to compensate for his stupid limitations. You step in more often, take on more responsibility, and manage fights in ways that reduce risk to him rather than enhance your own effectiveness. And over time, that dynamic becomes frustrating, because a follower should reduce pressure, not add to it. Roggy's low level cap also limits his ability to specialise. Many followers in Skyrim carve out a role for themselves, whether as tanks, archers, or hybrid fighters who complement specific playstyles. Roggy doesn't get the chance to fully establish that role because his progression stops too early. Whatever strengths he has remains undeveloped, never reaching a point where they can compete with high-level companions. This becomes especially noticeable when you start comparing him to other followers available around the same time. Characters who continue to scale, even modestly, begin to outpace Roggy in every meaningful way. They deal more damage, survive longer, and adapt better to different types of encounters. Roggy, by contrast, feels increasingly static. And in a game where growth is a central theme, that lack of progression stands out more than almost anything else. There's also a broader issue tied to how players interact with followers over time. In Skyrim, companions often become long-term partners, travelling with you across multiple quests, regions, and storylines. You build a sense of familiarity with them, even if the game doesn't always support deep character development. But for that relationship to work, the follower needs to remain viable. Roggy doesn't. His usefulness has an expiration date, and it arrives much earlier than most players expect. Once you pass a certain point, bringing him along feels less like a choice and more like a handicap. You're not just playing the game, you're playing around his limitations. And that's where the real problem begins to take shape. Because Roggy isn't actively disruptive in the way some followers are. He doesn't block doorways excessively, doesn't spam dialogue, doesn't interfere with stealth in obvious ways. On a surface level, he's relatively unobtrusive, but that subtlety is what makes his issue more insidious. You don't notice it immediately, it creeps in gradually as encounters take longer, as fights become harder, as his contributions feel smaller and smaller, until eventually you realise he's not keeping up. There's also a missed opportunity in how his character is presented. Roggy is a miner, someone grounded in the everyday life of Skyrim. Characters like that can offer a different perspective, less heroic, more personal, more connected to the world's smaller details. But that potential is never fully realised. His dialogue remains limited, his personality doesn't evolve, and his role as a follower doesn't expand beyond basic functionality. So when his mechanical usefulness fades, there isn't a strong narrative reason to keep him around. He doesn't compensate with depth, he doesn't offer unique interactions, he doesn't change how you experience the world. And in a game where players are constantly discovering new followers, new abilities, and new ways to play, that lack of staying power becomes a significant drawback. Roggy isn't just outclassed, he's outgrown. Comparing him to other problematic followers highlights this even more clearly. Lydia, for example, can be disruptive in stealth, but remains viable in combat due to her durability. Serana introduces chaos with her necromancy, but scales well and remains powerful throughout the game. Even someone like Koznak, while underwhelming, doesn't fall off quite as sharply because his limitations are consistent rather than progressive. When you actually have a look and fully compare Roggy Knotbeard to Serana, the contrast couldn't be more extreme, and it really highlights just how different problematic can look in Skyrim. Roggy's issue is limitation. He falls behind, caps out early, and eventually becomes ineffective. Serana's issue is the opposite. She's constantly active, constantly influencing combat, and often too involved in ways you can't control. Where Roggy fades out of relevance, Serana dominates the experience whether you want her to or not. In combat, Serana remains powerful throughout the entire game. She scales well, uses magic effectively, and can handle herself in difficult encounters. Roggy, on the other hand, struggles to keep up past the early game, turning into more of a liability than a support. So from a purely mechanical standpoint, Serana is clearly the stronger follower. But that doesn't make her less problematic, because while Roggy becomes easier to ignore as he falls off, Serana becomes harder to manage the longer she stays with you. Her necromancy clutters fights, her AI can disrupt positioning, and her forced follower status means you have to deal with it for large parts of the Dawnguard questline. Roggy gives you less over time. He's a great early player follower, but Serana demands more of your attention from start to finish. And it's that lack of clarity that makes the experience feel less intentional and more restrictive. It's not a designed progression, it's a hidden ceiling that suddenly becomes very visible when you hit it. And so that's what ultimately defines Roggy Knotbeard as one of the most problematic followers in Skyrim. Not because he disrupts your gameplay in obvious ways, not because he behaves erratically or intrusively, but because he quietly stops being relevant long before the game expects him to. In a world that keeps growing stronger, Roggy stays the same. And in Skyrim, standing still is often the biggest disadvantage of all. When you really break it down, a problematic follower in Skyrim isn't just about being weak, annoying, or badly written. It's about friction. It's about how much a companion pushes against the way you want to play the game. Because at its core, Skyrim is built on freedom. You choose your build, your pace, your approach to every encounter. A good follower should support that. A problematic one interferes with it. And that interference can take different forms. Sometimes it's mechanical, followers like Lydia or Barbas getting in your way, breaking stealth, blocking movement, or pulling you into fights you don't want. Other times it's scaling, characters like Roggy who simply can't keep up, turning from helpful companions into liabilities as the game progresses. Then you have followers like Serana who are strong but overwhelming, forcing their playstyle onto you through constant necromancy, forced presence, or disruptive AI. And then there's the more subtle cases. Followers like Koznak, Torva, or Rhea aren't chaotic or intrusive, they're just lacking. They don't bring enough to justify their place. No strong identity, no standout ability, no real impact. And in a game full of better options, that absence becomes its own kind of problem. Even personality plays a role. Someone like Cicero shows that a follower doesn't need to be weak to be difficult sometimes. It's about how they feel to have around. If their presence becomes distracting, repetitive, or unsettling over long periods, that affects the experience just as much as bad mechanics. So what really makes a follower problematic? It's when they take more from your experience than they give. Whether that's control, immersion, efficiency, or enjoyment. When that balance tips in the wrong direction, the follower stops being a companion and starts being something you have to work around. And in a game built on choice, that's the one thing players notice the most.